Dakota Territory, 1888. While every homesteader oriented their cabin for wind protection or trail access, one Norwegian immigrant did something his neighbors called backward. He turned the long wall south and cut two large windows into it. Glass was expensive. Windows were considered heat leaks. The accepted wisdom was clear: you heat a cabin with wood, not sunshine. Neighbors insisted he was wasting money on glass instead of thicker logs. They called his cabin upside down. Then January arrived. Temperatures dropped to 20 below and stayed there for weeks. Snow buried the woodpiles. Fuel shortages became critical. Standard cabins burned through cord after cord, stoves running day and night, and still froze by morning. But that backward cabin? On clear days, the sun alone raised the interior 15 degrees by noon. He lit his fire at dawn and dusk, nothing more. His woodpile lasted weeks longer than anyone else's. What did he understand about winter sun angle and thermal mass that every other settler missed, and why did the cabin they mocked become the one that didn't run out of fuel? If real survival stories matter to you, subscribe for more documented history. Comment your city and time so we know where this found you. The first hard frost arrived in mid-October. Morning temperatures dropped to the low 20s, and neighboring cabins began running their stoves before dawn. The Norwegian lit his fire just after sunrise and let it burn down by mid-morning. On clear days, sunlight began striking the south-facing windows by 8 o'clock, angling through the openings and spreading across the packed earth floor. By 10 o'clock the interior temperature had risen from the low 40s into the mid-50s without adding fuel. By noon, with outside temperatures reaching only 30 degrees, the cabin interior measured between 55 and 60 degrees. The stone hearth, the log walls, and the exposed earth floor absorbed the incoming solar heat and held it. His neighbor to the east noticed the chimney sitting cold at midday and assumed the Norwegian was rationing wood too early in the season. He mentioned it during a chance meeting at the creek in late October, warning that trying to save fuel in autumn meant freezing in January. The Norwegian invited him inside. The cabin was warm enough to work without a coat. The neighbor touched the hearthstones and found them still radiating heat from the morning fire. He looked at the sunlight pooling on the floor and said nothing. He left and did not return. November brought colder nights and shorter days, but the pattern held. On overcast days the Norwegian burned wood steadily, keeping the stove fed and the interior above 45 degrees. On clear days he let the sun do most of the work. The low winter sun, now angling at 27 degrees above the southern horizon, penetrated deep into the cabin through both windows. The thermal mass of stone and earth absorbed the radiation during daylight hours and released it slowly after sunset. Interior temperatures remained 15 to 20 degrees warmer overnight than in neighboring cabins of similar size. He was burning less than half the firewood his neighbors used, and the difference was measurable. A supporting figure, a literate homesteader who kept a daily journal, began recording the Norwegian's wood consumption and the behavior of the cabin during clear versus cloudy stretches. He noted that on sunny days the chimney often showed no smoke between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. He observed that the hearthstones retained warmth well into the evening, and that water left in a bucket near the south wall did not freeze overnight even when outside temperatures fell below 10 degrees. He did not yet understand the mechanism fully, but he recorded what he saw. Standard frontier cabins operated on a different principle. Small windows, sometimes shuttered entirely through winter, kept radiant heat loss to a minimum but also blocked any solar gain. Stoves were positioned against exterior walls or in corners, concentrating heat near the source and leaving far corners cold. Interior temperatures swung wildly, 70 degrees within 3 feet of the stove, below freezing at the walls by dawn. Firewood consumption ran between 3 and 5 cords per winter, and families woke to frost on the inside of the walls and ice in their water buckets. The accepted method worked, but it required constant labor and an uninterrupted fuel supply. The Norwegian's cabin required neither. He split and stacked wood at a measured pace, watching the sky as carefully as his woodpile. When the sun shone, he rested. When clouds settled in, he burned what he needed and nothing more. By late November he had used less than half a cord. His neighbors had each burned through a full cord and faced 3 more months of deeper cold. They stopped calling the cabin backward. They simply stopped talking about it. January of 1889 arrived with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. The cold settled in during the second week and did not break. Morning lows reached 15 below, then 20 below, then held at 30 below for 6 consecutive days. Snow cover deepened to 18 inches across the open prairie, drifting to 4 feet against north-facing walls and blocking access to timber stands. Homesteaders who had planned on cutting additional firewood through winter found themselves unable to reach the trees. Fuel supplies that had seemed adequate in November became critically short by mid-January. The neighbor to the east was burning through his woodpile faster than expected. His cabin required a fire every 3 hours to prevent the interior from falling below freezing. He was using nearly a cord every 10 days, and his stack was visibly shrinking. By the 3rd week of January he began rationing, letting the fire die back between feedings and accepting interior temperatures in the low 30s overnight. Frost formed on the interior walls within 2 feet of the logs. Water buckets froze solid. His family slept in layers near the stove and woke to see their breath indoors. The Norwegian's cabin operated differently. On the rare clear days, even in deep cold, the low sun angled through the south windows and raised the interior temperature by 15 degrees without any fire at all. He lit the stove at dawn to take the edge off the morning chill and again at dusk to hold warmth through the night. During midday, if the sky was clear, the stove sat cold. The hearthstones absorbed solar radiation and released it slowly after dark. The packed earth floor stored heat during the day and moderated overnight lows. His interior temperature rarely fell below 40 degrees, even on the coldest nights, and he was using less than a third of the wood his neighbors burned. Smoke poured constantly from every other chimney in the area. The Norwegian's chimney often sat silent at noon. His neighbors began to notice. The skeptical carpenter who had warned him about wasting money on glass rode past the cabin on a bitterly cold afternoon and saw no smoke rising. He assumed the homesteader had run out of fuel or was too stubborn to admit failure. 2 days later he encountered the Norwegian hauling water from the creek and asked directly if he needed firewood. The Norwegian thanked him and said his pile would last through March. The carpenter looked at the stack against the north wall and counted what remained. It was more than he himself had left, and February had not yet begun. By the end of January, 3 families within 2 miles were rationing severely. One household burned furniture to extend their supply. Another sent the husband on a 3-day trek to a distant timber claim to cut and haul emergency fuel. The Norwegian continued his pattern, burning only when the sun did not provide enough warmth, and his woodpile lasted. The journal-keeping neighbor recorded the contrast in plain terms. Outside temperature, 28 below. Norwegian's chimney, cold from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. His own stove, fed every 2 hours without pause. Fuel remaining, less than 2 weeks at current consumption. The crisis was not weather. It was method. And the method everyone had trusted was failing. The neighbor to the east arrived at the Norwegian's door on a clear afternoon in early February. He did not ask for firewood. He asked to sit inside for an hour and warm himself while his own cabin sat empty and his stove cooled to conserve fuel. The Norwegian opened the door without comment. The interior was warm enough to remove a coat. Sunlight spread across the floor from both south-facing windows, and the hearthstones radiated steady heat though no fire had been lit since dawn. The neighbor sat near the stones and said nothing for several minutes. Then he asked how it worked. The Norwegian explained in plain terms. The south-facing wall captured the low winter sun. The windows allowed solar radiation to enter and warm the interior directly. The stone hearth, the log walls, and the packed earth floor absorbed that heat during daylight and released it slowly after dark. The principle was not complicated. The sun provided free heat for 6 to 8 hours every clear day. A stove could not compete with that, and no amount of firewood could replace it. Orientation mattered more than insulation. Thermal mass mattered more than stove size. The neighbor listened, thanked him, and left. He did not mock. He did not argue. He simply acknowledged what he had seen. Within a week, neighboring families began unshuttering their windows during daylight hours. One homesteader removed wooden shutters entirely and left his single north-facing window open to whatever sun reached it, though the gain was minimal. Another nailed a sheet of tin behind his stove to reflect heat back into the room rather than losing it through the wall. These were small adjustments, adopted quietly without formal discussion. No one announced they had been wrong. They simply changed what they were doing. The journal-keeping neighbor continued his records. He noted that unshuttering his south-facing window, though small, raised his midday interior temperature by 4 to 6 degrees on clear days. He calculated that this modest gain reduced his daily firewood consumption by roughly 15%. He wrote that he had dismissed the Norwegian's design as impractical but now understood it as the result of observation, not accident. He added that he intended to reorient his next structure and increase his window area on the south wall. By mid-February the cold had broken slightly, and families who had survived on rationed fuel began planning for the following year. The skeptical carpenter, whose own cabin had come dangerously close to running out of wood, mentioned during a gathering at the settlement store that he would be adding a south-facing window to his own place before next winter. He did not apologize. He simply stated his intention as though it had always been obvious. Another homesteader, preparing to build a second cabin for a married son, asked the Norwegian directly about dimensions, window placement, and hearth positioning. The Norwegian answered each question with measurements and reasons, offering no judgment for the years of mockery. Spring construction began in late March. For new cabins within a 5-mile radius were laid out with their long walls facing south. 2 existing cabins were modified with additional south-facing windows cut through the logs and framed with salvaged timber. The shift was not dramatic. No one wrote articles or held meetings. The method simply spread through demonstrated results, adopted by men who had spent a winter watching smoke pour from their own chimneys while the backward cabins sat quiet and warm in the cold sunlight. By 1892, south-facing cabins were standard practice across the northern plains settlements within 20 miles of the original homestead. New construction followed the pattern without discussion. Builders oriented the long wall south, cut 2 or 3 windows into that wall, and positioned hearths or stoves toward the interior rather than against exterior logs. The method appeared in letters sent back to relatives in established states, described not as innovation but as common sense learned through hard winters. One homesteader wrote to his brother in Iowa that a cabin built backward to the sun would use half the firewood and stay twice as warm, and that anyone planning to settle the Dakota frontier should remember it. The journal-keeping neighbor compiled his observations into a short manuscript intended for a regional agricultural bulletin. He included temperature measurements, wood consumption comparisons, and construction specifications. The document circulated through county extension offices and was eventually referenced in a homesteader's guide published in 1895. The guide did not credit the Norwegian by name. It simply noted that south-facing orientation and adequate window area on the solar side of a structure could reduce heating costs by 25 to 60% depending on local climate and construction quality. The principle was presented as a regional adaptation, not a personal discovery. The Norwegian continued working his claim. He added a small barn in 1890, oriented south with wide doors that could be opened during winter days to warm the interior and closed at night to retain heat. Livestock housed in the structure required less feed during cold stretches because they expended less energy maintaining body temperature. He did not advertise the design. Neighbors simply observed it, noted the results, and built similarly. Within 5 years, barns and outbuildings across the region followed the same orientation pattern as the cabins. The original cabin remained in use for more than 2 decades. Its walls darkened with age and smoke, but the windows stayed clear and the hearthstones continued to radiate stored solar heat on cold nights. Visitors unfamiliar with the region's building practices sometimes remarked on the unusual number of south-facing windows, and long-term residents would explain that it was the old way of doing things, learned when fuel was short and survival depended on working with the sun instead of against it. No monuments were raised. No credit was claimed. The method simply became tradition. Modern thermal studies conducted in the mid-20th century confirmed what the Norwegian had known through observation. South-facing windows in northern latitudes, combined with thermal mass materials like stone, earth, and dense wood, could provide measurable passive solar heating. Interior temperature gains of 10 to 20 degrees on clear winter days were documented and replicated in controlled environments. The principle was formalized, taught in architecture programs, and labeled passive solar design. Researchers examining historical homesteading patterns noted that many frontier structures built after 1890 exhibited these characteristics, particularly in the upper plains and mountain territories, though the origins of the practice were rarely recorded. The backward cabin was never photographed. No detailed drawings survive. It was dismantled in the early 1900s after the homesteader moved to a larger house built on the same principle. The stones from the hearth were reused. The logs were milled for other projects. What remained was the knowledge, carried forward by those who had watched it work and taught it to others without ceremony or claim. On the northern plains, the homesteaders who lived longest were the ones who learned early that the sun was fuel too, and it never ran out.